Good morning from San Francisco. It's Intersections. I'm John Kao, and normally when you have a jet plane, you have two pilots, and normally we have two hosts. But today, Brian Solis, my erstwhile colleague, is otherwise occupied, so I'm going to fly solo for this show. He may join us a little bit later. So, Intersections, the combination of innovation, design, culture, technology. We're actually closing in on our 1 year anniversary, which is hard to believe. The pandemic has kind of shifted our perspective on the passing of time. Sometimes time feels like it has completely expanded, even though only a few days have gone by. And sometimes a month goes by and it feels like a few days. It's like that old Hollywood device of showing the passing of time by the cascading of the leaves from the calendar. And so hard to believe that we've been around for a year. We're closing in on 100 interviews. So we encourage you to go to intersectionslive.com and check out the archives, because almost all, if not all of the interviews are evergreen. The big themes that have been discussed there are not going away anytime soon. We are also closing in on a newsletter construct that will be amplifying our reach and also our ability to interact with all of you. And we are also keen to get viewer input during the show, because the show is really done for all of you. That's, the kind of COVID idea that Brian and I came up with to basically try to harvest our joint passion for the topic of innovation and to offer it up to all of you. So today, we're going to improvise quite a bit. It turns out that our first guest, Truls Berg, someone whom I know quite well and think the world of, is stuck in Norway. I mean, he lives in Norway. He's not stuck in Norway. Norway is a great place to be, but time zones and other responsibilities have caused him to want to defer his time with us. We are going to have at the top of the hour Soumitra Dutta, who is a very important and very engaging personality in the innovation field. Among other things, he is the founder of the Global Innovation Index. So he has a lot to say about comparative national strategies and what's going on in the world, kind of the ever updated nature of innovation, the character of innovation, and so on. So you'll definitely want to sit in for that. But what I thought we could do, we've gotten a lot of feedback from time to time that, Brian and I don't really talk about ourselves that much, and not that we're the most interesting people in the world, but we definitely have stuff going on. And also backstage, Gregarious, our engineer and producer, also is a very interesting person. So what I thought I would do in the 20 minutes or so we have before Soumitra shows up is to do two things. One is to myself talk a little bit, share with you a little bit about what I've been working on, but also the entrepreneurial projects that I'm involved with, and then shine the spotlight on Gregarious, who normally is completely backstage, because he's in the throes of a startup as well. And this is all to kind of demonstrate, in a way, our bona fides with regard to how we actually know something practical about the topics that we're talking about. So I think that should provide us with ample and interesting material to share with you. So, if I look at the pie chart of what's up for me these days, it kind of divides itself into three basic segments. One is continuing to do whatever you might call thought leadership contributions. And that principally involves not just Intersections, but my column on Forbes.com, which I feed intermittently, but really like, because Forbes has given me the benefit of being able to write things and push send and have them posted on their website without any editorial oversight or bureaucratic hassles. And so as an example, before the show, I dropped a new article called "What are Meta Proficiencies and Why Do They Matter?" Meta proficiencies meta proficiencies to me are related to the concept of the six intelligences. And they're really the things we need to know how to be good at that sit on top of all of the layers that we commonly refer to as skills. And they have to do with the ability to exhibit what Li Kai-fu, who was interviewed on the show 3 or 4 weeks ago, called warm skills, and what often are referred to as 21st century skills, or soft skills, or critical thinking skills. And skills really are very task oriented, but meta proficiencies operate at the highest level. So the ability to exhibit what is inherently human in terms of empathy, and in terms of compassion, and psychological and emotional acuity, in terms of understanding what's going on in another person, and connection building, and trust building, and caretaking, and so forth and so on. These are not the subjects that are typically taught in school, but if you think about where we are in terms of, for instance, the encroachment on the labor market by artificial intelligence and data science, the disruption in career paths, because it used to be in the industrial era, you went to school, you took specific courses, you got specific grades. Based on those grades, you were able to advance a certain distance, and you were able to access certain employment opportunities. And then you were in a different kind of institutional factory, where you would progress up the ladder in a large rule-driven organization. And that picture, which was a little bit of kind of central casting, is now increasingly obsolete. We live in a world where the ability to create and to exhibit agility and tolerate uncertainty and to be able to design your own life are really the principal skills of career management. And so making the transition then from talking about thought leadership to entrepreneurial activities, one of my current projects is working with a colleague of mine who just left Salesforce to partner up on building a platform that uses artificial intelligence and data science to automate credentialing, upskilling, and the accessing of employment opportunities, all related to being able to tap into the ocean of learning assets that now live in the distributed space that we all share. So that's a mouthful, but if you think about the fact that today it's all very analog, you go to school, you have a transcript that sits in a filing cabinet in some academic institution. You may have a guidance counselor to push you in certain directions or help you in certain directions. Then you got the demand side with companies that are looking for certain kinds of people. And then you've got all these learning assets, which up until, the modern era have been locked into educational institutions, but are now broadly available in the distributed space, not connected to institutions. And all of a sudden, you have a really big opportunity for AI and machine learning to be able to create a platform, there that integrates the supply and demand side of talent and the resources required to navigate your career. So that effort is called milliondoors.com. It's very much a under the wraps project right now, but just to demonstrate that, we kind of practice what we preach around here. And, then related to all of that, of course, is my abiding interest in innovation. And, starting a company based on novel technology is innovation. Talking about innovation in a kind of thought leaderly mode is innovation. But the other thing I wanted to share with you very briefly is that a chunk of my time these days is devoted to a return to studying music, which is something that I was very professionally or pre-professionally serious about until the age of, I would say, 18 or 19. So pretty, late in the game, so to speak. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd made the decision that after a hiatus of decades, I would engage in formal music study again, with specific reference to studying jazz, which is a music that I've always loved, but had found kind of not super accessible and a bit opaque. Once you've learned how to play music with the sheet music and it's ingrained in your fingers, and your job is to study the notes and play them correctly, it's a little bit challenging to then put that aside and say, with the same level of musicianship and sensitivity to the source code, the music, to be able to create music in the moment, to be able to improvise it in a way that sounds good. It's like really, it is exactly in my mind now like mastering a language. You decide you want to study Italian, and it takes a while, constant practice, not necessarily being that proficient, and adding to your skills layer by layer. And it's a process at the outset that takes a year or 2 years just to get to the rudiments, and then a lifelong process of really getting proficient so that you can express what's inside of you to others outside of you in a way that is authentic and fluid and so forth and so on. So that's kind of like my inner curriculum with regard to practicing innovation, but doing it at a very personal level. And one thing that we're going to enjoy in the middle of November, I've got some lessons with a guy named Kenny Werner, who is very well known in music circles for writing a book called Effortless Mastery, which is really all about mindset in relation to creativity and improvisation. And we're going to have him on the show to really talk about his knowledge and how that relates to a much broader audience, because whether you're leading a startup or a company, or you're, an innovator working with a team, there are meta proficiencies, which I would argue jazz and other disciplines are very good at teaching, and where certain traditional avenues for learning in general are not so effective. So that, in a nutshell, is what's going on with me. Before I turn it over to Gregarious, because I think he's got a story to tell as well, I want to invite the audience out there. If you have any questions for me, or you want to just tell us where you're coming in from, where you're located, we will be happy to post your comments. And also, if there's anything that I said that sparks a question in your mind, let us know. Maybe what we'll do is we'll let that invitation simmer, and let's bring a Gregarious up. Greg is normally backstage, so you don't really get a chance to see him, even though his background is much more interesting than mine, because it's actually a real background as opposed to this, which is just a little bit of Zoomware. But hey, Gregarious, so welcome to the show. Welcome to the front of the stage.
Good to be here. Good to be here as always. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you're here always, but not necessarily here in the front. So one thing, I think it would be interesting for the audience to hear is your own entrepreneurial journey, with particular reference to the new project, because we're not just people who sit around in the studio and talk to people. I mean, that's really that is kind of the icing on the cake. But we're all in the trenches doing stuff, and Greg, not the least of the doers. So what's going on with you these days in terms of the new venture?
Well, it's been quite busy. Earlier this year, I've sort of been on a journey trying to find a new way to help creators and, business experts and others sort of figure out how to make a living doing this content thing. Unfortunately, despite the fact that there are like almost 50 million creators, 48 million of them are part-time, and most of them can't still quite make minimum wage, right? Or sort of
and get out. This is 50 million in the US or worldwide?
Global. I think it's largely a US centric number based on the primary platforms, but yeah, that number is obviously growing. YouTube just had some stats out today. It was really amazing that they said they full-time equivalent in jobs that they support basically from YouTube alone is something like 230 million or 240 million jobs, full-time jobs, which I think is super powerful. But what we've been building at Zealous is ultimately, I think like the loyalty kind of CRM platform of the future. And that goal is really that, as we build, much like here on Intersections, we build an audience over time. It'd be great if we knew who those folks were. Right. It'd be great if we could connect with them in more modalities than, say, simply when we're live. But obviously, when we are live, we'd like to maximize their opportunity to participate and their thoughts and their ideas in this process. And so Zealous is a live streaming platform that enables us to sort of go live and broadcast out to wherever you want to go. But more importantly, it's designed to sort of bring your fans in real time into the conversation with you. And we kind of do that today, like with comments, right? And with chat messages, but with Zealous, you can actually do it with video and audio.
So we'll come back to Zealous in a bit, but you've been down this road before. This is not your first rodeo, as they say, and you've been involved in other startups before. So if we were to put on the lenses of meta proficiencies and just try to understand, what you have to be really good at beyond the nuts and bolts of, doing an Excel pro forma or something like that. What do you know now that you didn't know when you were at the beginning of starting your first venture? And what do you think is the most important knowledge?
Well, there's an infinite sea sort of in between now and then, but I would probably argue there's a few important lessons that I've learned. I actually have a tweet. It's one of my most famous tweets right now. There was like sort of 5 things that I did point out for folks about entrepreneurship. And, number one was just that you're going to fail, right? Failure is almost a certainty. I was talking to a young entrepreneur just the other night, and she seemed offended that I was saying like 95% of these people are going to fail. And I was like, I'm not judging them. It's not like I want them to fail, but unfortunately, they will fail, right? Like it's just very hard to run a startup, right? Starting a new business, starting anything new, a new idea, right? A new organization, a new nonprofit, a new business, all of them are hard. The world is stacked against us being successful. And so you have to really get used to the idea that failure is sort of a perpetual state that you oscillate between, right? And you probably wallow in it more in failure feelings and modes than you do in success feelings and modes, right? Over time. So learning to weather that and learning to contextualize that, I think is like probably one of the most important skills you're going to pick up as an entrepreneur, right? Because not all failures are created equal, right? Some of them are telling you to stop, and some of them are telling you to try something different, right? And so you've got to figure out which one you're getting, which kind of signal you're getting when you get the feedback from the market and from the world at large. So I would say that's probably my main advice. The other one I say is like choose your co-founders very wisely. It is a marriage. You may be with them for 5 to 7 years, which is longer than many marriages these days. And so, money, the number one thing that usually kills a startup is money, but the number 2 thing is often going to be literally co-founder troubles or issues, right? So just get used to that idea. The only last bit of advice I'll share, because I do see our guest is here, so we may be able to transition over to him sooner. But the only other bit of advice I'll give you is that it's a pretty terrible thing to do to yourself to become an entrepreneur. And for one reason that I think most people don't think about, which is just that it's an addictive, freeing experience in a lot of ways, and it is very hard to go back. Right? It is usually only dramatic changes in your life circumstances that make it sort of like requirement, but otherwise most entrepreneurs I've met become lifelong entrepreneurs. So once you begin that journey, just be ready that you may be stuck in that boat in one way or another for a very, very long time.
There's this saying in military affairs that the best way to understand your situation when you're in the middle of mortal combat is that you're dead already. And then, you just go forward. And I don't mean to sound morbid, but this notion that, you're always on the precipice when you're starting a company, and you have to accept that and not engage in groundless or baseless optimism, which I think might be why you're the person you were describing got a little offended. It's like, hey, you're being so negative, but you weren't. You were being realistic. And then the other thing I'll just underscore, and I guess this would be my number 1 lesson, and this is million doors, I can't even remember how many startups, is to be choosy about who you pick to lead the company. If you're not going to be the CEO, who you're going to work with, who you're going to be inviting to be on the board, and then be choosy again, and then be extra choosy on top of that, and then be choosy on top of that, because the things that will impair the quality of your experience and will scuttle your venture are having the wrong people, or having people who are the right people but imperfect in ways that have fatal flaws. And often you don't know that in advance, so then you have to read and react. And humans are imperfect by definition. So you often, as you said, it's like a marriage. You don't really get to know your partner until years into the relationship. You find out what's really going on.
Well, and I think related to that too is just that if you're a founder of a company, you should not. And I've made this mistake on my own, as well as you shouldn't necessarily expect that you'll be there the whole time, right? You have a shelf life as well, right? And so it's entirely possible that you need to hire someone, with a different skill set than yours to take over sort of the functions that maybe you played previously, right? And so it's hard for founders to often get used to that idea, but it's probably a necessary evil, relatively speaking, if you want to be truly successful and scale.
We used to call that entrepreneur's disease. The idea that the entrepreneur. A lot of entrepreneurs see their venture as like their theater where they get to be the star. Yeah. And it's hard to step down from that position for personal and psychological reasons. But there are so many stories of ventures that are dragged down into the flames because the entrepreneur doesn't know when to share the responsibility for making the company successful. And starting a company and then sustaining it and growing it are two very different skill sets. So,
for sure.
Keeping that in mind.
Fundamentally different. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, let's see if our next guest, or our next guest, because you were kind of the first guest, is on deck. He, I saw him on video, and then he went.
He's in the studio, but I don't see his camera on yet. Oh, there
he is. Okay, yeah, he's been listening. So let's bring him up.
Indulging me for a small time, and I will move back so we can bring Soumitra up as well.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Thanks, Greg. Well, so it's a real pleasure to have Soumitra Dutta on the show. We are colleagues, and we've known each other a good long while. In a way, I look at Soumitra and I think about the road not taken, because, I had those 14 very enjoyable years at Harvard Business School, but then kind of made the decision to hit the silk and bail out. Whereas Soumitra he stayed the course. So he's a professor of management and former founding dean of the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell in New York. He is the co-founder and president of the Portolans Institute, which is a research platform and education NGO in Washington. And one of the tastiest facts about Soumitra, and one that I'm sure we're going to want to talk about, is that he founded something called the Global Innovation Index, which has become the influential gold standard for evaluating the performance of countries in the innovation, the global innovation race, I would say, and is also the co-founder of the Global Information Technology Report, which is a publication of the World Economic Forum. I could go on and on. He's on a number of boards. He's received a number of awards and accolades. So we're very fortunate to have him. And I'm privileged to be on the advisory board of the Global Innovation Index, and to kind of have a little bit of a kind of an aperture to peek into Soumitra's terrific work. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to interact with you on this show once again. And thank you so much for also being a very valued member of the advisory board of the Global Innovation Index.
Well, thank you. Kind words indeed. So I note that the index is coming around to another cycle, that it is published annually, and that there's some things on the launching pad. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what we can expect, but also what the process is.
Yeah, sure. I'll be very happy to share with you, John. So in fact, we just launched the index on September 20th, so about 2 weeks ago. And it was a great launch in Geneva. We had 3 heads of state and about 6 ministers participating in the launch. And, it's been a long journey, sort of. I started the journey in 2007 when I was a professor at INSEAD. And, in 2011, the United Nations, WIPO, basically came on board. And I think since WIPO came on board, it's received really wide claim acceptance, I think, in the innovation policy leaders world.
So what goes into the the index? What's the what are the components? How does the index get done every year?
No, thank you, John, for asking. And my own interest in innovation peaked when I started observing that technology was leading a lot of innovations in emerging markets. I used to travel enough as part of my own work in different countries in India, Latin America, and so on. And I saw this lots of great innovative concepts being created with mobile technology, with other kinds of simple technology that people had access to in these markets. And a lot of that innovation was not being captured by the traditional metrics of innovation. So if we go back 15 years, the traditional metrics are very much focused on what I would say the classical science and technology metrics, patents, PhDs, publications, citations, and so on. And those are still very relevant. Don't get me wrong, they're still very important, but a lot of the innovation in emerging markets don't really get captured by these kinds of metrics. And a lot of innovations are not really patented. You don't need a PhD to innovate. So I felt there was something missing out there. And that's what led me to think about how can you measure innovation when essentially it is not an activity limited to a small group of PhDs or a small elite group of researchers, but much more when it's broad-based across society, when everyone in society can potentially innovate. So that was the basic philosophy, that everyone is capable of innovating. Every small business is also capable of innovating. And then we thought about what is required to enable that to happen. So we have the whole idea of some factors or conditions which are enablers, which enable an economy to successfully innovate, and some which are outputs, which are actual elements of concrete outputs that an economy produces when it is innovative. So we combine the two. On the enabler side, we look at a range of things. For example, the quality of institutions, of course, the quality of the educational human sort of infrastructure, the general infrastructure in the country, the business sophistication, the market sophistication. On the output side, we of course do measure the traditional elements of patents and knowledge and technology and PhDs and so on. But we also look at creative services sectors, so elements like the movie industry, or for example, television, or the publications in general, even including online publications that people publish online. So what we are doing right now is also an example of an innovative output at an individual level. So I think we try to measure all of this in the innovation index.
So one of the interesting things about the index is that it's about countries, and so countries change their position on the index. I had a conversation recently with a senior government official in Colombia, and he was very pleased that Colombia had moved up in the index. And one thing I'd be curious about is to see whether there are specific enablers or factors that are most correlated with a country's ability to change their position, right? To spurt up in the rankings or to fall back down, because you collect a lot of different kinds of data. I suppose you could say that that's a great opportunity for some kind of data science and sort of AI analytics. But there must be a few variables that pop out as being most discriminating in terms of a country's ability to move within the index.
So so every country we do analysis in terms of where the strengths lie and where the weaknesses lie. So for any one country, if you go and look, you can identify, for example, what are the strengths. For example, the US is ranked number 2 in business sophistication in the worldwide. US is ranked number 2 in the market sophistication. The US clearly has strengths on the elements of markets and businesses. The US doesn't do as well in the environment, so environment clearly is an area of weakness. So I think every country has those weaknesses that need to be corrected to help improve it. But on the whole, what I feel is that at least the way we define innovation, that's very important, because you could define innovation as being an element of activity done by a small few, elite few. But if you define it as something broad-based inside the economy, then essentially looking at trying to create that capability in the country as a whole to enable every individual, every small business to be innovative. So essentially what it becomes is that for us it's like links in a chain. You have a chain, you have links, And every link needs to be strong, because if one link is weak, then essentially the system is not as strong. So every country has its own sort of drivers of what enables it to move and progress. And that is something which varies country to country. So, for example, the US might have a different set of drivers and India might have a different set of drivers.
Right. So I'm really curious to also understand a little bit more about what the countries do with the report. So now you have the ranking, and you've got somebody from the Ministry of Economic Affairs saying, okay, we moved up 3 or we moved down 5. And how does the report translate into supporting a local agenda for building innovation capacity? And I mean, because you must have a lot of anecdotal or maybe even pretty systematic data now on what countries do or can do with that information.
Now, I have been very impressed at seeing how different countries, the leaders in the different countries, have adopted this metric so, fully inside their own innovation agendas of the country. From my perspective, what it does do is, first of all, it gives you a framework to think about innovation, because innovation can be this abstract theme. And it's everywhere and nowhere. So in some sense, it gives you a framework to think about things. So the ability to think about something in a structured way is very important. And that is something which is often missing in governments. So at least they have a structure and framework to think about things. The second, which is very important, is they can actually benchmark themselves vis-a-vis their own performance over time and the performance vis-a-vis other relative countries they might want to compare against, in the same income group, on the same geography, or whatever it might be. So you have a comparison basis, and comparison is very, very important, because essentially what happens is a lot of the policies and actions put in place are driven by how you feel you're faring relative to others. So that comparison is very important, and you have a basis for comparison until it's uniform. And third, what is very important is it allows you to get into some more detail in your own country, because every country has specific initiatives and has specific innovation agendas. And our overarching framework is very correct, but the variables that we use to measure the framework are very general. They're not actually linked into the specific countries, specific objectives. So what we encourage countries to do is also create some kind of localized versions of those frameworks that reflect much better their own national agendas and policies. So, for example, I'll give an example. In Indian government has adopted the GII, the Global Innovation Index, very widely. And now what they have done is they have created, based on the global GII, an India Innovation Index. Mm-hmm. And then they're using that to measure the performance of the various states. Now, India has, like the US, various states, and each state is trying to compete for investment, trying to actually be more attractive for investors. So it provides some kind of motivation for the states to also, put in place right policies and right action agendas to help become more innovative and to essentially attract investment. So the different ways in which people use it. But I have found that, I have written many academic papers like you, other books also. But what has impressed me is having the support of WIPO is very useful, because that gives it the institutional credibility. And then what you have is governments adopting it to use to make improvements. A little bit like the doing business study of the World Bank, which unfortunately the World Bank is stopping now. But that also led many governments to look at what they're doing inside their own country and make improvements in what they're doing. So I think as long as you have an international benchmark for comparison and improvements, that is good impact.
It sounds like there's an opportunity to create some tools, whether we would call them playbooks or software tools or facilitation tools, and then advisory services to kind of take the information from the Global Innovation Index and translate it into the practitioner world. Is that something that exists already, or is it something you've thought about? I mean, I recognize that the goal here is not to create a consulting company, but I mean, in my own limited experience, when I was running workshops for National Chief Innovation Officers, and this is now back in this is 20 years ago, really. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say almost. The idea of creating frameworks and tools that would enable the agendas to be organized, and then as I mean, knowing what to do and actually doing it are two different things, right? So implementation requires support and many other resources that simply being smart and having the idea doesn't.
No, so you're absolutely right on. So we get many demands for this, many requests from many governments to try and say, okay, how can we actually, is there some kind of process or methodology we can put in place inside the country? We have shied away from doing that because we don't want it to become a game of moving up the rankings necessarily.
Yeah.
But what we have done is we have worked with governments and advise them about what can they do better to adjust or to make the innovation agendas more effective. So that kind of advice we have given, and often the advice is very linked to the country-specific objectives and the country-specific, development, let's say, status. We haven't actually formulated that into a generic methodology as yet. But there's something interesting that we're trying to do right now at the corporate level. So corporations are also very important players in this whole innovation debate.
Sure.
And if you look at the innovation frameworks for corporations, we feel that there is a need for some rethinking on that also. And the reason for that is a lot of the innovation frameworks exist in corporations have traditionally focused much more on what I would term as a classical process improvement, incremental innovation kind of an approach, okay, driven by the total quality management approach that has dominated a lot of process thinking inside organizations. But today, as you know very well, John, disruption is everywhere. And disruption and data and digital sort of is at the core of a lot of the changes that organizations are being confronted with. And I do not think that there is a good innovation framework that actually accounts for that disruption in the organization that many corporations are facing. How do you actually have a framework for that? Now, I know that there's been wonderful work done by the late Clay Christensen and others, in this area, but, we are hoping that we can create some kind of a new framework that incorporates this need to do both the innovative incremental work and the disruptive work and bring it together for corporations. That's actually ongoing work right now. And I'd love to be able to talk to you a little bit more about our work in that area.
Well, sure. I mean, it seems like if you looked at it as Venn diagrams, and most of the academic work on innovation has been done with enterprises, not with societies.
Right.
So, you could say from the outset that the purpose of innovation differs because countries are not in the business of, calculating net profits and giving bonuses. They're supporting the well-being of their citizens and pursuing the human adventure, et cetera. And yet a lot of the anatomy and the physiology of innovation works. It's just at a different scale. So and corporations, as you say, are important actors in the national landscape. So the question then becomes how to create truly contemporary frameworks that are useful for making decisions. Also, I mean, it seems to me, and from my experience, I've worked with maybe 8 or 9 governments over the years, that government is often the problem because the speed of innovation is rapid and increasing with AI and data science, and the speed of adaptation, to say nothing of innovation in the public sector, is often much slower.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can you sit on a public sector platform that's progressing slowly and accurately observe what's going outside, which is happening so fast? And I wonder, I mean, I presume that you've encountered that a fair amount, but I wonder what you think about that.
No, I agree. I think, the government can be a sort of brake on innovation in many ways, especially if they control regulation and regulation is lagging behind. That can be an issue, as we have seen, in some cases in the COVID era. But the government is also, I think, an important leader, an important catalyst in striking innovation, and making it happen in organizations and country. If you look at, for example, the U.S. government itself, the President Biden now has taken a very, strong position in helping support and push innovation in AI, data sciences, ML, and other key areas. And in the past, the government has also focused on driving innovation in key areas like the internet itself, and, for example, the GPS and other big projects like that, the Genome Project, and so on. So I do think the government has this duality, multiplicity of roles. And a good government is able to balance those roles. It has to be a good leader at times. It has to be a good catalyst at times. And of course, try and avoid being a brake on innovation most of the time. But of course, we live in a real world, and our governments work in different constraints, as you say. And so, there are other political issues that affect them. But I do believe that if you have a supportive government environment, corporations can thrive. Ultimately, the action is in the corporations, and corporations can thrive, and they feel more confident that they can invest in the future, because you invest in R&D when you feel more comfortable of the future. If the future is uncertain, then obviously you reduce your investment. This is the reason why the US remains, for many people, still the preeminent destination for investment innovation in new areas, because people still trust. The trust is there that the US will continue to provide a good supportive environment for the future. And I think that's really, the government does play a role in all these things, the way the leaders speak, the language they use, the kind of actions they undertake. All these things speak volumes in terms of how the country and other leaders, corporate leaders in the country, view innovation and the government role of innovation.
So I'm wondering also, with this vast amount of knowledge that has been accumulated, whether or to the extent to which it has applicability to cities. There's a lot of discussion about cities are where it's at, and the majority of humans are living in cities, and cities are where innovation is going to occur. And as a subset of that, I've noticed that there's a bit of a trend to innovation cities within cities. So you have Station F in Paris, you have the Biopolis in Singapore. There's a project that I'm somewhat acquainted with in Bogota that's going up as a national grade level science and innovation city. So I wonder, about the applicability of the frameworks in the Global Innovation Index to cities, and also what you think of this phenomenon of trying to create these kind of bespoke or special purpose cities within a city for innovation. Is that really a really smart strategy, or something else?
So we have looked at innovation at the city level, and we are expanding our work in that area. So one of the things that we started, I think, about 3 years ago, was we started looking at the innovation happening at a city level. So in the Global Innovation Index, we do have a ranking of cities, but of course the number of indicators that we use out there is rather limited. We have to expand the use of indicators out there. Right now, we're doing it mainly based on publications and patent data, and you get an interesting, visual representation of which cities and which countries are the most innovative in terms of generating those outputs. But the notion of having smart cities is very, very appropriate for all the reasons you mentioned. A large part of the GDP is based in cities. A number of people living in cities is significant, and so on. And we have also done work on smart cities using some of the same framework and the same ideas of the Global Innovation Index. So my colleague Bruno Landva, he has done a lot of work in that area, and so we publish reports on that too, on smart cities. I think the whole idea of using centers of excellence, or as you described it, like Biopolis or Station F, so some centers to attract talent and to be able to create innovation in a city is very important, because you need those magnets. If you don't have those magnets that attract talent, if you don't have those magnets that create some kind of supportive environment, you will ultimately not succeed in driving innovation at a fast pace. So look at, for example, Station F. You mentioned this example in Paris. Before President Macron became the president, there was a number of initiatives in France, but it wasn't really, let's say, picking up at a fast pace. And then Station F was formed. And after the formation of Station F, talent has actually come to Paris. And today, by many measures, Paris is actually more innovative in terms of entrepreneurial ventures than Berlin. Berlin, which was traditionally the, let's say, very entrepreneurial hotspot in continental Europe. So I think this kind of leadership, this kind of change is important and does make a difference. And once you have a magnet for talent, then the other ecosystem builds around it. People are at the heart of innovation. There's no question about it. Good people, attract other good people. They create new technologies. They have ideas reaching new markets. And of course, universities play the same role. Where you live, Stanford and Berkeley, they play the similar roles of attracting talent. And then that talent basically works as magic. So I think these kinds of micro centers are very critical. As you know, in New York City, we are, I'm part of the Cornell team that helped create the Cornell Tech project in New York and Roosevelt Island. There's again a similar attempt to try and draw, the talent towards New York City. Recently, I visited New Lab, in Brooklyn. And New Lab is again a wonderful initiative of how we can actually bring talent to New York and retain them in New York, and make them sort of much more part of the innovation system in New York.
Mm-hmm. So one of the, I think, enablers of innovation is whether there's a stewardship process for thinking about strategy and allocation of resources and the vision and so forth and so on. You said something earlier which made my ears perk up, which is that you thought most countries at this point had some kind of an explicit innovation agenda. You're probably in the best position of anybody in the world to collect that kind of information. And I wonder if we could unpack that a little bit more, because obviously, there have been countries like Sweden that have had innovation agencies forever. And, there's a phone number in the national government directory for who to call if you want to talk about innovation. But there are many countries that have been approaching that level of stewardship. And then related to the cities question, I imagine one of the issues around cities is that the idea of a city innovation manager or innovation coordinator is still a new concept, with the exception of places like Helsinki and Paris and, so forth and so on. What's the current state of play with regard to innovation stewardship at both the country level and then at the city level?
No, what we see very clearly is you need that leadership for devising and placing innovation at the heart of the country's agenda. Now, if you look at historically what has happened in many countries, they had ministries for technology or ministries for R&D. Science and technology was a typical, let's say, name given to these ministries, and they focused on one aspect of innovation.
Sure.
And I think what has happened now is people have realized that innovation is much more of a horizontal platform. It cuts across many different ministries and many different functions. For example, education and finance and technology, all of these are part of the innovation sort of challenge. And if you want the country to progress, then you have to create either a ministry with some superpowers across other ministries, or a separate body that, in fact, has an ability to coordinate actions across ministries. Just the Ministry of Science Technology is not good enough for this. And a similar notion actually is happening also at the city level. You have mayors of cities who are realizing that you need to have this kind of a focus on innovation to drive the city forward. The other day I was listening to a program in which the mayor of Miami is focusing on trying to build technology into the city and move the city base much more broader. Mayor Bloomberg tried to do it in New York City when he realized that technology and entrepreneurship technology was very critical for the future of New York City. So you need that kind of leadership to make it happen. And good leadership does matter. It's very, very important. Good leadership matters. What I often tell people is that even if you go to poor countries, let's say, for example, my country, home country, India, it's very interesting to see how many times and how do the leaders of the country speak about technology? How do they speak about innovation? They might phrase innovation technology in a very different context. They might say, okay, for example, Prime Minister Modi will say, let's use technology to help alleviate the lives of poor people, come to help them reduce corruption. So the focus areas are different. It is put in the context of the country's problems, but still they talk about technology all the while. And this is not the case in some other countries. Some other countries, technology is not hardly ever mentioned by the leadership. And that reflects down in the entire ecosystem. So I do think leadership is critical, both at the national level and city level. And, it's something critical for the innovative success of those regions or cities.
Well, you're in the best position of all, I imagine, to both make some statements about best practices as regards stewardship at the national and also at the city level. Just exactly what you said. From an organizational perspective, if you don't have the clout to create integration at the national level, you're going to get what most countries, I think, today still have more or less, which is a fragmented approach. So, you'll have people financing innovation, but maybe a little reluctantly, and you'll have S&T, you'll have education, you'll have the military, which is trying to innovate in its own way. And I mean, I think innovation touches every aspect of government agendas, but up until now, the integration mechanisms have been few and far between. And it's a different problem set, but an analogous problem set in cities, right? And so you're in this data collection, that monumental data collection that happens every year. I mean, it seems to me that, there is an opportunity to transition from description to, if not norming, at least, providing indicative examples of patterns of success and lack of success in relation to certain, organizational and leadership agendas.
No, absolutely. And, we do get called in to observe, advise many of the initiatives. So I'll give you an example. I gave an example of India earlier, but let me give an example of another large country, Brazil. Brazil, as you know, is going through a challenging political time, where the level of support for R&D and innovation at the leadership of the country level is sometimes not that evident. But having said this, even in a difficult time, what you find is that the industry can actually take significant action. So in Brazil, for example, the National Industry Confederation has created a movement for innovation with all the top leading corporations in the country. And they are basically using that movement called MAY, led by Gianna Sagazio, to in fact drive innovation across the country, and at the same time try and push the government to be more supportive of innovation agendas at the corporate level and national level. So I do believe that even in different environments, different contexts, you can have actors, whether it's corporations or leaders, coming and pushing for innovation agendas in different ways.
Sure. We have a few more minutes. I'm curious to know what you think about the current state of innovation in the U.S. We did some work together over a year ago now on reimagining American innovation, which I think did translate into some of the pending legislation. Yes. We had the Senator Schumer's chief economic policy person present at those workshops, and even our success at having the word innovation included in the new organization that's being proposed, I think, is an outcome of that workshop. What's your sense of where the U.S. is at right now, and are you excited about the legislation that was Endless Frontier that's become USICA, that hopefully will become some version of USICA and not get watered down in the House? I mean, where do you see us as being?
No, see, the U.S. is clearly a leader. In the latest ranking of the Global Innovation Index, U.S. is ranked number 3. So it's, for a large country, it's extremely highly ranked, very successful. And personally, I am very, very optimistic about the U.S. future in innovation, and partly because U.S. still remains the magnet for talent. Now, yes, there has been some damage done in the last few years, in terms of attracting talent around the world. But still today, I think the damage is limited and the damage is reversible. So I do believe the U.S. will remain the destination for talent. Capital will follow talent. Yeah. And as long as the U.S. government is able to provide the right infrastructure, both in terms of regulation and in terms of physical infrastructure, the right ports, airports, and so on, all this also matters. I have no reason to doubt why the U.S. should not continuous leadership in technology. Now, yes, it is true that China is coming up very fast. There's no question about it. And regardless of the controversy around, how China may or may not have gotten some of its IP in initial years, the fact is today Chinese companies, many of them are doing extremely well. And in our own ranking, China is ranked number 12. It has come up very significantly, globally in the global rankings in the last 5 years. And this is a result of a lot of investments the country made over the last 20 years. It's not a result of a 5-year story. It's a 20, 30-year story. And I do believe that there are many good practices globally that still can be adopted, by the US. Many things the US does can be adopted by others. And on the whole, I do think that US should be and will be an important destination innovation in the future. I do think, however, that it's important for the US to remain open because innovation thrives in an open environment. You need ideas coming in, you need to create ideas that you share with others. So if that openness is threatened, I think that will not help US innovation succeed. Innovation is really built on openness.
So the legislation also involves pouring new money into specific lanes of emerging technologies and setting up these innovation hubs. Speaking of Station F, these are city-sized investments to, finding a city where there's a university and a latent industrial base and high potential and things of this kind. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at some of the drafts, but where do you place the government's agenda on innovation in the U.S. in terms of, too much, too little, just right? Is it a Goldilocks kind of agenda, or are there gaps?
Well, no, it's a give and take process to some degree. So, the government, of course, as I mentioned earlier, has played an important role in U.S. innovation historically, and I expect will continue to do so in the future. But at the same time, the government also has to provide important, stability in the entire system and support the whole education infrastructure of the country. So when you ask me the question, how is the government doing? If I take a broad sort of brush approach and look at what the government has been doing in this last several years, I would say it is quite good. Can it be better? Yes, it can be better. And the areas where the government is probably trying to correct some of its, let's say, weaknesses in the future. So I think the regulation you mentioned clearly is one way to do it, because clearly we have to be able to, the challenge right now in innovation often is how do you make innovation more inclusive? And, we know how to create this innovation ecosystems to some degree, but the challenge is innovation is still not inclusive. And if it's not inclusive, it creates inequality in the country. And that we have seen happen in the US too. So if you look at, for example, Palo Alto, where you live, a lot of the native people in Palo Alto have been priced out of the markets, for a number of reasons. And even getting into this ecosystem, Boston or Palo Alto, is not easy if you're a certain gender, a certain racial group, and so on. So I do think there's an important element of direction that can be provided by good collaboration across the government and local stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. I see the book title now, Inclusive Innovation.
Well, I think that's an important agenda. I was, chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Innovation, and there were a bunch of 15 experts around the world. And we discussed and we said, what is the most important issue that we face in innovation globally? And the issue was inclusivity. Mm-hmm. How do we make innovation more inclusive? Because innovation has been great, but unfortunately hasn't been inclusive.
Well, that could be the opening question for another round of conversations. I note that we're at the bottom of the hour, and you were kind enough to show up a little bit early, so we actually got in a good and substantive conversation. But it's such a big topic that there's certainly more that could be discussed, and I think we also identified a couple of follow-up topics to brainstorm about offline. So with that, Soumitra Dutta, thank you so much for being here. This was a really great excursion into the world of large-scale innovation.
Thank you very much, John. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. There you have it. Now, I am noting that our erstwhile producer, Gregarious, who's also an entrepreneur. Oh, he's back. He's back. Okay. So, Greg, why don't you take us out? We're done with the interview. Thank you to all for attending today and participating. And stay tuned, because there are some very interesting things coming up in due course that you will not want to miss, as they say. So all the best from Intersections.